There's a place in the middle of the Bay of Bengal, an island so remote that when you look out from its shore, there's nothing in any direction except ocean. The British Empire discovered it, claimed it, and eventually decided it was the perfect place to send the people they wanted the world to forget. They called it the Andaman Islands. The prisoners who were sent there called it something else. In Hindi, it was Kala Pani, literally translated black water. That name wasn't just geography. For a Hindu man in 19th century India, crossing the ocean, the Kala Pani, meant losing your caste permanently. You'd return home not just a prisoner who'd served his time, but a person who no longer belonged to the society that raised him. Your family might refuse to touch you. Your community might treat you as if you died. Crossing that water wasn't just exile. It was a kind of spiritual death sentence attached to a physical one. The British knew this, and they used it. Here's what most people don't know about the British Empire's prison system. When you think of colonial-era punishment, you might picture something crude: chains, hunger, neglect. And sure, plenty of that existed. But the thing that made Kala Pani different, what made it genuinely unique in the history of imperial prisons, wasn't brutality in the obvious sense. It was design, deliberate, calculated, almost architectural in its precision. The British didn't just build a prison on the Andaman Islands, they built a machine. And the machine had one purpose: to break a person so completely, so methodically, that by the time they were finished with you, there was nothing left to set free, even if they wanted to. Let me back up a little, because to understand what Kala Pani became, you need to understand why it existed in the first place. 1857. That's the year that changed everything in British India. You might know it as the Sepoy Mutiny, though that name has always bothered historians because it undersells what actually happened. This wasn't just soldiers complaining about greased cartridges. This was a widespread, violent uprising across northern India. Civilians, soldiers, local rulers against British rule. Cities burned. British officers were killed. There were atrocities on both sides, horrific ones. And when it was over, the British had reasserted control, but they were shaken in a way they hadn't been before. They had a problem. They had tens of thousands of prisoners, political prisoners, soldiers who turned, civilians who'd taken up arms, and they had no idea what to do with them. Hanging them all wasn't practical. Keeping them in Indian prisons felt dangerous, too close to home, too close to the communities they'd come from, too close to the ideas that had led them to rebel in the first place. The Andaman Islands were the answer. The British had actually tried to establish a penal colony there before, in 1789, but disease had wiped it out. In 1858, after the rebellion, they tried again. This time, they sent 200 prisoners from the mainland, then more after that. Within a few years, there were thousands. But the island settlement, as brutal as it was in those early years, was still improvised. Prisoners could, in theory, interact. They could form friendships, they could talk, they could maintain some thread of who they were. And that, to the men running this system, was a problem. So, in 1896, they commissioned something new, something that had been theorized about in European prison design for decades, but never quite executed like this. Something that would take everything the British had learned about confinement and refine it into a single structure. Construction took 10 years. When it was finished in 1906, the Cellular Jail, that's what they officially called it, was unlike anything that had existed in the British Empire before. 7 wings, each one radiating out from a central tower like the spokes of a wheel. And in that tower, a single observation point from which a guard could theoretically see down every corridor at once. There were 698 cells, each one roughly 13 feet by 7 feet. A small window, high up on the wall, too high to see anything useful through, designed to let in just enough light to stop you going completely blind. A door with a small slot in it. That was it. That was the cell. But here's the thing about the design that people miss when they first hear about it. It wasn't just the cells, it was how the wings were arranged relative to each other. A prisoner in Wing 1 could, if they craned their neck and looked through their little high window, see the exterior of Wing 3. They could see there were other people there, but they couldn't communicate. Couldn't shout between wings, the angles didn't allow it, couldn't see another face, could perceive the presence of other human beings without ever actually reaching them. It's hard to explain how psychologically precise that is, unless you've thought about solitary confinement and what it actually does to a person. Humans are social animals in the most fundamental sense. Take away all human contact and the mind starts to fracture. Studies on this have been done for decades, and the results are always the same. Isolation is, measurably, a form of torture. The cellular jail's architects understood this, either consciously or intuitively, and they designed around it. They didn't just isolate prisoners, they gave them the constant, unignorable awareness that other humans existed nearby and made sure they could never reach them.
It was loneliness with a window. The people who built this thing were proud of it. And the question of who they sent there, who they decided deserved this particular kind of suffering, that's where the story gets really unsettling. The men who ended up in the cellular jail weren't, for the most part, the people you'd expect. Not hardened criminals, not violent offenders in any conventional sense. They were writers, lawyers, teachers, young men who'd printed pamphlets, students who'd attended the wrong meeting, people who'd said publicly and loudly that India should govern itself. In the eyes of the British administration, that made them the most dangerous kind of prisoner there was. Not dangerous because of what they'd done, but because of what they believed and how effectively they could communicate it. The word the British used was sedition, seditionists. Say the wrong thing, print the wrong words, and you could find yourself on a ship crossing the Black Water with no date of return on your paperwork. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, one of the most prominent voices in the Indian independence movement, was tried for sedition twice. The charge, essentially, he'd published articles suggesting that Indians had the right to resist colonial rule. For that, he was sentenced to 6 years in a prison in Burma. He was lucky in a perverse way. Others got the Andamans.
The prisoners who arrived at Port Blair, the main settlement, were processed, assigned a cell number which would become more their identity than their name, and introduced to what passed for daily life inside the cellular jail. Wake before dawn, a small amount of food, rice and lentils usually, sometimes barely enough to sustain basic function, then work. And here's where I want to stop for a second, because the work deserves its own explanation. The British could have put these prisoners in cells and left them there, simple confinement. Instead, they assigned labor, and the specific kind of labor they chose was again deliberate in a way that seems almost studied. Many prisoners were assigned to the oil mill. The Andamans had coconut palms everywhere, and extracting coconut oil was economically useful. The mill was simple, a large wooden wheel connected to a grinding mechanism, the kind of thing that on any Indian farm would have been operated by a bullock, an animal. Here, the prisoners replaced the animal. They were harnessed to the wheel and walked in circles, pushing it for hours at a stretch. Think about what that does to a person psychologically, not just physically, though the physical damage was real. The strain on joints and muscles from walking circles for hours under tropical heat. But what it communicates. You're not a political thinker here. You're not a writer or a lawyer or someone with ideas worth fearing. You're a bullock. You are exactly as significant as a work animal. Walk in your circle, be useful. That's all you're for now. Other prisoners made rope, coir rope, from coconut fiber. Quotas were set, a certain weight of rope per day, and if you didn't meet your quota, there were consequences. The most common, a reduction in food, which made it harder to work the next day, which made it harder to meet your quota, which meant less food again. It was a cycle that, if you were unlucky or unwell, could spiral quickly. Punishment beyond missed quotas took other forms. Solitary confinement within solitary confinement, a darker cell, a smaller cell, chains at the ankles. There was a punishment called gunge, where a prisoner could be placed in handcuffs attached to the wall at a height that forced them to stand, arms raised, for extended periods. Not quite hanging, you could rest weight on your feet, but for hours at a time, the stress on your shoulders and back became excruciating. Flogging existed too,
It was official policy, regulated by the colonial administration, which almost makes it worse somehow. Not a guard losing his temper, an official, scheduled punishment. There's a moment that appears in the accounts of multiple prisoners from this period, and it stays with you. You'd wake in your cell, and for a second, maybe the first few seconds of every morning, you'd forget where you were. Then the ceiling came into focus. The sound of the ocean outside, which in any other context would be peaceful, became this constant reminder that you were surrounded by water and there was nowhere to go. And then the slot in the door would open and your food would appear, and the day would begin again exactly like the day before. No newspapers, no books for much of the jail's early operation, though this was eventually modified. No letters in the beginning, no visitors obviously. Just the cell, the work, the food, the ceiling. What it did to people's minds was predictable. Breakdowns were common. Men who'd arrived composed, ideologically committed, certain of their purpose, they'd fracture. Some became passive, compliant, barely present. Some became erratic. Some, in the deepest stretches of isolation, began talking to themselves or to people who weren't there. And the British administration noted all of this carefully. The jail had a medical officer. He kept records, and those records, if you read them today, are one of the more disturbing documents in the history of colonial administration, not because they describe suffering with horror, but because they describe it with the flat neutrality of someone monitoring a machine. Prisoner number, mental state deteriorated, placed on reduced rations for non-compliance, condition noted. Condition noted. There's one man, though, whose story sits at the center of everything that happened in the cellular jail. A man who arrived young and furious and wrote his name into the walls with whatever he could find. A man the British were specifically afraid of, specifically wanted silenced. And what happened to him there, and what he did in response, is something that historians still argue about today, for reasons that are genuinely complicated. That man was Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. And understanding him means understanding something uncomfortable about what imprisonment can do to a person's beliefs. Savarkar was 27 years old when they sentenced him. 2 consecutive life sentences, 50 years total, though the phrasing used in the judgment was more theatrical than that. Transportation for life twice over. He'd been convicted on charges related to revolutionary activity against British rule. He'd helped smuggle arms into India, maintained connections with militant anti-colonial groups in Europe, and was considered by the British intelligence apparatus to be genuinely dangerous, not a pamphleteer, a revolutionary. When he arrived at the Cellular Jail in 1911, he was already well known among Indian nationalists. He'd written a history of the 1857 uprising, the same uprising that had created Kala Pani in the first place, which the British had banned before it was even published, which tells you something about how seriously they took him. They put him in a cell, they assigned him to the oil mill, and for the first years, by his own account and by the accounts of people who knew him, he held on. He wrote poetry on the walls of his cell with whatever he had, sometimes a nail, sometimes charcoal, memorizing each poem before the next one could cover it. He organized other prisoners when he could, passed messages when it was possible, tried to maintain some semblance of the person he'd been before he crossed the black water. But the cellular jail was designed precisely to make that impossible. And after enough years, enough mornings of waking to that ceiling, enough circles around the oil mill, enough isolation, Savarkar did something that would follow him for the rest of his life. He wrote to the British administration multiple times. He asked for clemency. He offered, in language that became increasingly accommodating, to accept certain conditions in exchange for release. By some interpretations, and this is where historians genuinely disagree, he effectively offered to cooperate with British rule. The Indian independence movement never quite resolved how to feel about this. Some saw it as a practical calculation, a man doing what he had to do to survive and continue the struggle.
Others saw it as a break, not just a strategic concession, but a genuine ideological shift that would define everything Savarkar believed and wrote afterward. The man who emerged from the cellular jail was different from the man who went in. Not unrecognizable,
but changed in ways that mattered. This is the thing about Kala Pani that I find most genuinely difficult to sit with. The machine worked. Not on everyone, not in the same way, not completely, but on enough people, enough of the time, that it achieved what it was designed to achieve. It broke things, beliefs, commitments, identities that had seemed unshakable. It took people who'd accepted suffering as the price of conviction and showed them, over years, how much suffering a conviction could actually cost. But there were others who didn't break, and what they did instead is the part of this story that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. By the 1930s, the character of the cellular jail's population had shifted somewhat. The early prisoners had been post-1857 convicts, often from a different generation, sentenced under different laws. By the 1930s, the jail was filling with men from the Indian National Congress, from various revolutionary organizations, people connected to the growing mass movement for independence that had been gaining momentum since the early years of the century. These prisoners knew each other in many cases before they arrived. They had networks, shared language, shared politics, and they organized as much as the design of the prison would allow. And eventually, they did something that the British administration hadn't fully prepared for. In 1933 and again in 1937, the prisoners went on hunger strike. Not one prisoner, not a small group, a mass hunger strike, coordinated across cells and wings in a jail specifically designed to prevent coordination. The demands were straightforward: better food, access to reading material, an end to the most degrading forms of forced labor, recognition that they were political prisoners rather than common criminals. The British response, initially, was to force-feed them. This is its own horror. Prisoners who'd been starving themselves as an act of political protest, held down and fed through tubes. Several men died during the strikes. Mohit Mitra died during the first. Mahavir Singh and Mohan Kishore Namadas died during the second. They died having chosen starvation over compliance, which is a kind of choice that's hard to fully comprehend but impossible not to respect. And here's the thing, it worked. Not immediately, not completely, but the strikes drew attention in India, newspaper coverage, questions in the Indian Legislative Assembly, public pressure that the British administration couldn't entirely ignore. In 1937, partially as a result of the sustained pressure from hunger strikes and political agitation, the Indian political prisoners were finally transferred out of the cellular jail to prisons on the mainland. The machine had its limits after all. Not because the British had become more humane, but because the prisoners had found the one thing the design couldn't account for: the collective refusal to disappear quietly. What happened next, both to the jail and to the people who'd been held there, is the part of this story that nobody really talks about, and it changes everything. Here's something almost nobody knows about the cellular jail. After the British used it to break Indian political prisoners for decades, someone else got a turn. In 1942, the Japanese military swept through Southeast Asia with a speed that shocked the British Empire. Singapore fell in February, one of the most catastrophic British military defeats in history, and by March of that year, the Andaman Islands fell too. The Japanese occupied the Andamans for 3 years, and during those 3 years, the cellular jail, built by one empire to destroy people who opposed it, was used by another empire for exactly the same purpose. The Japanese imprisoned local residents there, people suspected of collaborating with the British, people who'd done nothing more than be in the wrong place or be related to the wrong person. Some were tortured, some were executed. The structure that the British had engineered so precisely for suffering simply absorbed new occupants and continued functioning as designed. There's something almost physically uncomfortable about that fact. The British had built this machine, not with the explicit goal of using it themselves forever. They surely assumed it would one day outlive its original purpose, but they had no way of controlling what it became in other hands. The architecture of cruelty doesn't come with a conscience attached. The British returned to the Andamans in 1945, and by then, between the hunger strikes of the 1930s and the chaos of the wartime occupation, the political momentum behind the cellular jail had fundamentally shifted. India was 2 years away from independence. The system that had created Kala Pani was clearly approaching its end.
In 1947, India became independent. The Cellular Jail fell under Indian jurisdiction. And this is where the story takes a turn I genuinely didn't expect when I first started reading about this place. After independence, there was a debate in India about what to do with the jail. Some wanted it demolished entirely, tear it down, erase it, remove a monument to everything the British had done. Given what the building represented, that impulse is completely understandable. Some of the wings were, in fact, torn down over the following decades. But some wanted to preserve it, not as a celebration, obviously, as a witness. In 1979, the Indian government declared the Cellular Jail a national memorial, a museum. They left 3 of the original 7 wings standing. They kept the cells intact. They installed plaques bearing the names of the prisoners who'd been held there, all of them, the ones who broke and the ones who didn't, the ones who died on hunger strike and the ones who lived to see independence. Every evening now, there's a sound and light show at the jail. Tourists come from across India and from other countries. They walk through the cells that are still standing, they see the oil mill, they read the names. I want to be careful here because I think there's an easy, comfortable way to end a story like this, with something like, and now the suffering is remembered and honored, and that's a kind of justice. And I'm not sure I believe that. Memory isn't justice. A museum isn't reparation. The men who died there, the ones who starved themselves rather than submit, the ones whose minds broke slowly in solitary cells, the ones who crossed the black water and never came back, their suffering doesn't become meaningful just because we remember it.
What I think is actually true is something more complicated. The Cellular Jail worked for a while. It silenced people. It broke some of them. It extracted compliance through sustained, systematic, architecturally refined suffering. And it still wasn't enough, because the thing it was trying to destroy, the basic human desire to determine your own life, your own country, your own future, turned out to be more durable than 7 wings of solitary cells. Savarkar, for all the controversy that followed him, survived 50 years worth of sentences in 11 years and lived until 1966. Batukeshwar Dutt, who'd been imprisoned alongside Bhagat Singh in a different case and was later sent to the Andamans, survived and lived to see independence. The hunger strikers who died are remembered by name. The men who designed the Cellular Jail, who sat at their drawing tables and calculated exactly how to position the wings so that prisoners could see but never reach each other, their names are not particularly remembered. They accomplished something technically precise and morally catastrophic, and history, at least in India, has largely filed them under the British administration. There's a photograph taken inside the Cellular Jail, probably from the 1930s. You can find it if you go looking. It shows one of the corridors, the long, identical doors stretching away into the distance, the cells numbered, the light coming in at that characteristic angle from the windows designed to be too high to see through. It looks orderly, clean almost. Nothing in the image screams horror at you. That's the thing about this place that I keep coming back to. The worst prison in the British Empire didn't look like a dungeon. It looked like a system. It looked like something that someone had thought about very carefully. And the care that went into it, the deliberate, considered, patient engineering of human suffering, is somehow more disturbing than any amounts of chains and dark cellars could ever be. The Andaman Islands today are a tourist destination. Beautiful beaches, coral reefs, the kind of place people go on vacation and take photographs. The Cellular Jail sits there in the middle of it. 3 remaining wings, the names on the walls, the cells that haven't changed. If you ever go, stand in one of the cells for a minute, just a minute. Look at the ceiling, listen to the ocean outside, which you can hear just barely if it's quiet. Think about waking up to that sound every morning for 11 years, for 20 years, for a sentence that said 50, and then walk out because you can.